Hi, everybody. My name is Miles, and I'm with Peak Performers. I'm a disability Peak Performers. Thank you so much for joining me on the second installment of Disability. I'm so excited to have Warda joining me on today's discussion. Warda, welcome.
Hi, how are you? Um, my name is Warda, like you said. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so glad to have you, Warda. Every once in a while, I meet individuals across my daily interactions, and they leave a distinct impression on me. And I remember that with Warda, talking with them and hearing their story and thinking, wow, Warda would be really incredible to interview because they're such an interesting person. So, normally this is a bit of a throwaway question, Warda, but I actually think that it's probably the most important question that I'm going to ask you all day. Who are
Mhm.
you?
Yeah, so my name is Warda. I, as you can see, I use she, they, he, because I'm a gender fluid individual, so part of the LGBTQ. Um, I'm a Colombian Palestinian immigrant. My family and I moved to the United States when I was about 8 years old to Louisiana, so it was a bit of a culture shock, especially when it was like the suburbs of Louisiana. I was late diagnosed with autism when I was about 30. Oh, that's late. Sorry, sometimes I look back and I'm shocked. Um, and I also have comorbidity issues. So I've been diagnosed disabled since I was 12 years old because of my long term epilepsy. So that's a little bit about me. And currently, I work in accessibility as a coordinator at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, doing
And
accessibility
in
for
addition to
resources.
that, you're also an artist too,
Yeah, I love
right?
doing art. Creating is a way to express myself when words are really hard because with the autism, it takes a while to find the right words. So usually, art will help me express a lot of those words visually as well as with poetry. Mhm.
Fantastic. Warda, thank you so much. And by the way, if anybody happens to be joining us on the live stream, please take a moment in the chat to introduce yourself as well about you. And oftentimes I feel like when it comes to disability, that has a way of taking over public wise, kind of how we may perceive someone. And I myself have run into this before too, where I explained to somebody that, oh, well, I am hard of hearing. And all of a sudden they may treat me differently, or they may even call me something differently too. And it's weird. Like it's this weird disconnect that happens because it shouldn't happen to where disability kind of takes over the identity of the person. But sometimes it does too. And sometimes that's reinforcing too. I can't tell you how often I work with different job seekers that have been late stage diagnosed, or they're facing particularly acute barriers due to their disability within their job search. And they become so focused within that disability that they have that it becomes difficult for them to recognize the other parts of them that are really compelling and really a great asset to any future employer too. So I guess, why do you think that happens, Warda?
I think that has to do a lot with the way society has shaped disability in like a social hierarchy. Just as a whole, I don't think this is just like a United States issue. I think it has more to do with the idea that humans as a whole like to create hierarchies, racial, ethnic. They like to point out the differences in order to kind of create a hierarchy. And a part of that is disability. We can look at that historically, dating all the way back to kind of see that people who are disabled or with disabilities, depending on how you like to label that for yourself, are often treated differently because it creates a level of othering for those individuals that society can put and then often mistreat, and kind of like utilize, in a way. And it's unfortunate because that creates a lot of shame for the individual with the disabilities. I have that similar experience where for a long time just having to overcome shame about being epileptic, and you know, dealing with the idea that I'm different and that I have to navigate the world differently, and being frustrated that I live in a society where I can't meet the expectations, but it's because of things that I can't control because my body doesn't really, you know, I'm disabled, that my body sometimes, I have seizures sometimes. And then with the late diagnosis of my autism, I had the understanding of my perception of the world is completely different. And the way I communicated often led to a lot of misunderstandings. And that was a lot of grief and undoing of a lot of shame that I had to overcome to get to a point of self acceptance. And the issue with that is that the disabled community doesn't have resources to be able to overcome that shame that's instilled in us by society. So, how are we supposed to be able to navigate the workforce where it's just the expectation to be as, I guess, like normal? I put in quotation marks. But, we're supposed to maximize, I guess, efficiency and, you know, to be able to like meet certain standards that these organizations have, when those standards are often things that some days we might be able to meet to the top of our ability, but other days, because of our disabilities, we might not be able to meet. And that leads to long term shame that we need a lot of resources, community, and, mental health therapy, that often has a lot of barriers for us to be able to navigate and reach. Um, and that doesn't even touch the umbrella of intersects that come with race, ethnicity, and other aspects that come within a person that has not even more barriers, to be able to like reach those resources.
When we talk about it, when we talk about disability as a whole, we were talking about 26% of Americans and 1 billion people around the entire world. Like, this is a pretty significant chunk of people. And yet, even when you talk about disability, it's not really a good descriptor because the experiences are so wildly different. Being a person that is hard of hearing, my experience is totally different than yours as somebody who experiences epilepsy and autism. And, at the same time, you may not realize what it's like for me living with a sleep disorder and waking up, every couple of nights screaming due to phantoms over my bed, right? So these are such wildly different ways that we interact with the world. And yet we're all kind of lumped together within this larger umbrella of disability. And what I've observed is that there seems to be a bit of a separation in identity that is happening right now, where people are self-identifying within disability, disability being kind of the way that we traditionally view it, such as things like, I'm missing an arm, or I'm blind, or people with hearing loss like me. But then there's the whole neurodiverse bubble, and I regularly talk with people, and I say, oh, okay, you have ADHD, and they say, yeah, I have ADHD, but I'm not disabled, right? Like, they don't consider themselves in that category. And then there's still another group that, with the recent COVID-19 pandemic now over, there are still many people that are living with long COVID, and there's more and more people out there that are living with chronic illness. And due to the advances within medicine, we are able to support them, and they're able to live much longer, fruitful lives as well. And yet, a lot of times, they may not consider themselves disabled. Well, I live with a chronic health condition. So, I guess, is there any other kind of like large identities that you think are surfacing out there among these various different communities that still fall under the protection of the ADA?
Yeah, I think one that's been interesting to see, and maybe this is because of the spaces that I'm consistently in. It's more of a, because I'm, for context, apologies. I'm more in the activist spaces. So a lot of
Mm,
those are more focused on decentralizing the systems that already exist and taking back words that have been used negatively. So some of those communities actually take back the word crip and cripple. So I've seen
Mhm.
communities that come together and use that word as a word of empowerment
Mm.
and to kind of build community and kind of show that they're also decentralizing a system that chooses to other them as disabled individuals, whatever disability they align with is individuals, but as a whole, they choose to align more with that as an identity. That's
That's
another one
interesting.
that I've seen. Mhm,
Yeah. Taking back kind of the word that historically has been used to put
mhm,
them down. And it's interesting because many people that are on the outside, they express a certain level of frustration with the way the language changes, and I'm kind of want to just tell them get over it, right? Like language changes, things are going to change, and I might say the wrong thing, you might say the wrong thing. The biggest thing that we need to do is we need to listen and we need to adjust our language to talk to people how they would like to be addressed. And it just really is that simple that language is going to change and we should expect that. And in fact, I think one of the things that's interesting to me about even neurodiversity itself is that neurodiversity started out, from my understanding, as a way to describe autism and started within the autism community, but
mhm,
now has increasingly been used to describe anybody with a cognitive difference, which again, like just like disability, it's a broad umbrella. Like we're talking people that have ADHD or dyslexia, people with learning disabilities, people with traumatic brain injuries, people with even mental health disorders. I've found people
mhm.
describing themselves as neurodiverse too. So I guess like how do you think that even the term neurodiversity is going to further develop and change within that?
I think as it stands, it definitely helps. I think the advancements in research have obviously helped broaden the term. I think there needs to be a little bit more research because right now with younger generations, neurodiversity still always goes back to autism, like
Mm,
implications of autism, which often for those who are like looking on the outside looking in when you imply neurodiversity, but for those within the neurodiverse community, it's actually kind of trying to create like this community within the individuality. So I have coworkers and also friends who consider themselves neurodiverse, but they may have
mm,
ADHD, dyslexia, personality disorders, schizophrenia, the bubble across the board, but it's different cognitive and like, mental health disabilities that might have overlaps in the way that we process the world or communicate, but they're not quite the same because then we can actually like once we communicate with each other we start to be able to see those differences. So I think as time goes on the community might be able to advocate to the world like what those differences are and what they look like because neurodiversity is not a spectrum of disability that's visible,
mm.
so the communication about it is has to be a lot more direct and like thoroughly explained to those outside of the neurodiverse community in order for them to understand it. Yeah.
And even within all those things that you described, there's still different levels of cultural acceptance that exist within them.
Mhm.
And it depends on the context too. I will echo the sentiment that you said earlier. Any employers that are watching this after the fact and they want to start a neurodiverse hiring program, I would encourage you to be clear about whether you're intending to start an autism hiring program or whether you're fully intending to actually include all people with cognitive differences, because that does matter, right? And it isn't helpful necessarily when you say one thing but mean another. Yes, it's good to create jobs for all individuals, but for your own sake, as well as being able to support all the people, the diverse people that work within you that are attracted to these programs, it helps to be specific and be clear about what it is that you're looking for and who you're looking to support. But I think the other thing that stands out to me too is that there are some areas that are treated very differently within our society. So right now, I feel like probably the area that has the least stigma attached to it, maybe, I'm not sure, might be mental health, just because so many people during the COVID-19 pandemic experienced what it was like to be really sad and really lonely for long periods of time. And so it was became much more relatable for many individuals.
Mhm.
There's still lots of bad jokes about that out there, right? There's still lots of stigma, but it's more culturally accepted, and mental health awareness events are much more common. Somewhere in the middle, I think that there's ADHD, dyslexia, things like that, where people might almost consider it normal. In fact, I see many of my own friends that are identifying as your ADHD friend or your dyslexic friend or your dyslexic coworker. But
Mhm.
then on the other end of the spectrum, too, we may still see things that are very highly stigmatized. You mentioned your friend that has schizophrenia, and there is still an abundant amount of very rampant bias and discrimination towards those individuals. And it would be a significantly bigger person to disclose to their employer that they have schizophrenia
Mhm.
compared with somebody with ADHD. So, how do we begin to reconcile all this to make it so that everybody can bring their full self to work?
I think that's a like I guess like a layered question, because something that you touched upon is the level of acceptance, and I think that that level of acceptance has nuance based on the community that you're in.
Mm,
Because, for example, me being a part of like the Latino and Arab community, any type of mental health would not be considered something that's accepted.
okay.
I got my diagnosis with autism, and my parents still deny that I have autism. To give you some context, because it doesn't
Gotcha.
seem like high support needs autism, and that means that it can't be autism. So
Hmm.
it has to be a visible disability for it to be something that's actually a disability about something in like a Latino and Arab culture. So for a lot of Black and Brown communities, like you visibly have to have that disability in order for it to actually count as a disability. And oftentimes for us, when we go to mental health institutions, we end up getting misdiagnosed because of the health systems misdiagnosing personality disorders and bipolar. Because
Hmm.
prior to my autism diagnosis, I was misdiagnosed with bipolar type 1 for a while. So
Yeah,
that's
I feel like
just,
you finally said that word that I've been teasing about the whole time, right? That the word of intersectionality. You finally kind of
Mhm,
got us there. Thank you for pulling me back onto the rails here and back onto the subject. But
mhm.
yeah, let's dive into that specifically. Like, what is the experience and how might it be different, say, for example, for a white man going through and getting diagnosed with autism compared with someone who is born female and grows up in a Hispanic community with autism? Like, what's that vibe like? And like, what are what's that experience like, just for anybody that may not be familiar with that?
I would say white males hold a certain level of privilege with
Mm,
autism in particular, from what we understand within the community. That's very difficult because historically Asperger's was created. The terminology Asperger's was actually created during the Nazi Germany regime to be able to actually
mm,
allow these like low support needs autistic kids to actually be able to be taken out of the system that was labeling disabled children as disabled, that were being put in concentration camps because their families were wealthy enough to say that they were different, but they were still able to fit into society. And that's why that terminology was created. And that's why the community is deconstructing that. And for a long time, a lot of research was refused to be done um, for anyone that was born female or is
mm,
femme presenting, because they believed that autism was only something that men could have.
mm,
Um, so women, because of social structures, have to process and navigate the world, or like femme presenting people, in a way that forces them to mask and present a lot differently. So it presents a lot more quietly. It's a lot more observant and based on situation rather than a white man, like a white man with autism who's doesn't have to mask, and you can see those cognitive, like those lacks of social cues, I would say,
Mhm.
more blatantly because they were given a level of privilege with an early diagnosis to just kind of say these things and have a liberty because of their disability to lack that social expectation and nuance. And when you get into the intersect of the Latinidad, it goes a step further because not only are you focused on masking as like femme, like like femme presenting, but you're also focused on masking in a world that's predominantly white. So you have to worry about how you present yourself in certain spaces culturally. So if
Mm.
I'm going to a place that's predominantly white, I have to be careful about how I present myself as a Latino versus how I present myself as a Latino at home. And in Latinidad, there's a lot of like social nuances that are loud, that involve a lot of physical touch. And
Mm.
as a person with autism, where touch is hard and sensory issues are rampant, you have to learn how to mask that in order to allow yourself to be socially accepted by your own community, or
Mm.
else you become excluded by your own community and even your own family. So it's internal masking within your community and also learning how to navigate your identity as your community teaches you that it's treated outside of your own community. And
Mm.
so you don't have the blessing even after the diagnosis to really get to unmask in the way that I guess your white peers would, where you just get to fully kind of like work on yourself and learn your identity and then kind of just be fully autistic because you still have to navigate that ethnic and racial identity within yourself, understanding all of the socio-political aspects around you that were taught from when you were very little.
And what about being of Palestinian heritage? Like, how does that handle with disability, with neurodiversity? Like, is that a similar kinds of friction, or is it different in that way?
It's very similar. I'd say the Arab community and the Palestinian community, since it's a part of the Arab community, I can't speak for like the diversity within the Arab community, but for my Palestinian community, it is very much similar to the Latino community, very festive, very cheerful. Like when conversations happen and you're very like focused on it, you get louder. Sorry, excuse me.
Yeah.
But I think that's a blessing and a curse because I think when people get more passionate about it, they can be louder. So if I'm like super interested in a topic and I'm talking with my family, I don't have to censor my volume the way I would in like a conversation in a social setting where it's like a diverse group of neurotypical friends and they're like, why are you getting so loud about this? I'm like, no, because I'm really passionate about it. That I have to explain like all the 30 billion details. That's a blessing within the Palestinian community that really really is I think a blessing for the autism. I think something that's like really difficult though across both communities is that we both have a tendency to cut each other off in the middle of a sentence. And
Mm.
because the autism like structure, I'm like, you're cutting me off, but we still had a thought here. Like, can we? And they're like, this is just, how we are. And I'm like, I know I'm trying to balance the identity, the Latino identity versus the Latinidad versus the autism telling me that the structure has to happen with how conversations are laid out. And it's difficult sometimes.
And then going on to kind of the next identity that you talked about, part being queer and part of the LGBTQ community, I feel like as an outsider to that community, that it seems like it is more generally accepting of neurodiverse and disabled individuals. But again, I'm an outsider to that group. Is
Mhm.
how does that play within disability?
I would say there are parallels within the queer community that there are to the disabled community, where, yes, it will be generally more accepting to disabled folks, but the queer community still creates hierarchies
Okay.
within it. So, like a white man who's gay is going to have more privilege within the community
Hmm.
than a black trans woman with a disability. So,
Hmm.
you know, like it's always they're always going to have those intersects of white supremacy that end up kind of trickling down in this that bubble. And that's why you see a lot of the communities, disabled and queer, end up creating like microcultures, I like to
Hmm.
call it, where you see, like BIPOC only spaces or small like community events that are like maybe for like for black community only or for like the Latino community only or like this specific group only, because under the bigger umbrella, the issues of white supremacy sometimes are still very clear.
Hmm.
And so often we find ourselves trying to find smaller community within ourselves to try to kind of like share in sentiment about how, you know, we have these intersecting struggles
Hmm.
within that bigger umbrella. Mhm.
That's so interesting how all of those are kind of coming together. But, and then kind of finally to the kind of the last identity that you had talked about before, and that is being that of an artist. I think that artists, or at least I hope that many artists have a tradition of recognizing and celebrating disability. When you think back to Frida Kahlo, when you think back to um, many other various different artists that have been across time, but many of those still those hierarchies still exist. And there's also the question of who has the time, the leisure, and the money to be able to pursue art, and thus will gain kind of greater exposure. So, how have you found, kind of in the year of 2026, that art and disability intersect for you?
Mm, that's interesting because what you brought up before the question was a good point that I had just talked about at an artist talk with the community, where you being an artist full time is not really feasible, and
Hmm.
that's understood. However, I have found personally that art with disability is it's a good space for me to sit down and slow down, especially when the daily tasks become really hard.
Hmm.
So it gives me the space to express all of the like physical pain and like the overwhelming like mental drainage that comes from maybe just going to work one day and then having a lot of like mental drainage, writing a
Hmm.
small poem about it, or maybe just sitting and doodling in my notebook a little draft of an idea for a painting and knowing that be able to get to it over time, and taking my time with it and knowing that it'll be done over time instead of trying to get it done immediately in the moment with a deadline in mind. I think it helps with my disability. It helps me slow down in ways that the world sometimes feels like it doesn't allow my brain and body to. Yeah.
Hmm.
And I think that's very healing. It's, I guess, like the long run of saying things for me.
I love that. And by the way, what is your website, Warda, for people that may want to check it out and the artwork that you create?
Oh, yeah. I can put it in the chat really quick. Let me get it. apologies. It's Words of Warda, but let
Mm.
me look at it because it is giving me a bit of trouble.
By the way, while Ward is plugging that in, I see that we had a couple people that joined us live. Thank you for that. And thank you, Patricia, for tuning in. It's good to see you. And we're going to actually be interviewing Patricia in a couple of weeks. So I'm looking forward to that conversation as well.
Hmm, I don't know how to put it in the chat.
Don't worry about it. I will. I'll find it later, and I'll include it in the LinkedIn article write up. So not a big deal.
Thank
And
you.
but do make sure that you check out Warda. She's got a really interesting and unique perspective that
Mhm.
she can be found both in her written poetry as well as her visual arts too. So I guess kind of as we start thinking about all these different identities intersecting together and influencing each other, what would you want the layperson to walk away with an understanding of how they can be more empathetic, but also how they can um, listen better to your particular experience and other people with many different intersecting identities? How can they listen better and understand you better?
Hmm, I think there's two answers to that.
Hmm.
If they're not a part of the disabled community, neurodiverse community, whichever umbrella they fall under, take the time to listen and ask questions,
Mhm.
and be willing to hold themselves accountable when they make mistakes, learning how to navigate situations dealing with someone who's disabled. Because for someone who's like just connecting with someone who's disabled, they're not going to know right away, but they're going to make mistakes, but it's holding themselves accountable that really shows someone like me personally like the biggest difference in their commitment to want to be involved in my life and want to grow as a person and know that part of my identity, um, and how it works and navigates. Um, when you're a part of the community yourself, be willing to understand the intersectionalities. It's a little bit difficult at times, because it's already difficult to navigate and process being disabled. But sometimes, if you don't understand the lived experiences of others and how the systems in place affect other people,
Mhm.
you might not understand the privilege that you hold even within those disabled spaces. And that might take away from you being able to understand the frustrations that others hold and how hard it might be for others to navigate circumstances within, you know, the community that you might think are a little bit easier. So I think a little bit goes a long way, and a lot of learning and accountability will go a long way.
I love that. Be open minded. And I think it's also worthwhile to point out, too, that this is not a competition. Sometimes people may see it as such, right? Like, they're like,
Mhm.
oh, well, look at all the different barriers that I've overcome. Look at all the different. And it's not that way. That's not how it's structured at all. It's simply a point of understanding and how we can listen to other people, understand where they're coming from, and try to adjust to be as welcoming and empathetic to other people as well. By the way, shout out to Sully for joining the conversation. Thanks for Sully for your comment. And we had somebody that chimed in anonymously, but they are from Africa, so I appreciate that. And it's cool that we're getting some people from around the world that are chiming in today too. So finally, the last question that I have for you, Warda, is kind of going back to yourself, because I feel like so often when we get a recent diagnosis or when we've been living with a disability and it has a very real, very direct impact on our lives every single day, that sometimes we may get lost within that disability part of our identity and we lose track of all the other people that we are, all the other things that we are, right? So, to those people that are experiencing disability, perhaps they're going through a rough patch right now, or they've been recently diagnosed, how would you say that they should go about? speaking to themselves and thinking about themselves in a way that they can appreciate every part of themselves, including the barriers that they're facing right now?
First of all, that grief that they're feeling is totally valid. It's not something that, and it's like you said, there's no race to processing anything or, feeling and understanding anything. So it's much like the race to figuring out how many barriers you have. No, there's no race to overcoming your grief. It will take time. It's a slow process. But when you find yourself getting caught up in the moments where the disability takes the forefront, um, something that helps me is taking a step back and reminding myself, however best suits the individual, of the things that I'm grateful for about myself that aren't defined by the disability itself. Um, so, you know, um, it helps me kind of navigate looking outside of one part of myself and look into other aspects of myself that, you know, that don't feel so helpless in the moment. Mm.
Thank you, Warda. I appreciate it. And by the way, for anybody that is interested, Warda is available to consult around accessibility projects. We didn't even have a chance to dive into it too much, but Warda is an accessibility professional. And as you can tell, talking with them, they are able to offer such a wealth of perspective and such a wealth of nuanced, different lived experiences, too, that if you are engaging in something like that, I certainly hope that you'll reach out to them. I will include their contact information, or at least their LinkedIn information, into the article write up. But tell us about your accessibility practice right now.
Yeah, so I focus mainly as an accessibility coordinator at a museum. So
Mhm.
focusing on the logistics, programming, and digital aspects, just the whole institution as a whole, and giving them expertise on what their projects could look like when they can incorporate accessibility and go above and beyond, in terms of digital aspects, physical aspects when designing museum spaces, when they're working on creating programs, what a program and an event could look like in order to make sure that all of the guests that come in to those events feel welcome and included and have their needs met beforehand and during the event. So that way it's inclusive as well as equitable, I guess is the right word, rather than just making the person feel uncomfortable because of their disabilities, while they're at the event. So I do things like that. I also focus on language justice. So I believe that language barriers are a part of accessibility as much as, focusing
Mhm.
on accessibility for those within the disabled community. So making sure that those of us who have language barriers, when we come into cultural spaces, educational spaces, are able to have our needs met, in order to navigate the spaces so that we don't have to rely on our children for resources, for translations, or have to be missing out on the actual nuances and content that these spaces have to offer, um, for us.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Warda. I appreciate you coming on today. I've learned a lot, and also you've really kind of helped me broaden my perspective and how I engage with people beyond just the disability part, like, considering the entire person and all the different lived experiences that they have. Again, this has been Miles from Peak Performers. I'm a disability inclusion partner here, and hope that you'll join me next time for Disability Idea. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care.